Yo guys, and welcome back to another week of me building a self-tracking app in Svelte 5. And this week I started implementing the dashboard view. So this is pretty much what I managed to come up with. We have this nice little dashboard view where we can see what's going on in our life. We have some widgets here like the short widgets where we can see historically the value of a trackable. We can see our sleep here, and this is also connected here to this metric widget where we can have a single metric value shown. We can have either daily, weekly, or monthly as the time scope. And of course we can edit this dashboard, edit this widget if you wanted to see something else. Maybe we want to see our average exercise duration weekly. So if we select exercise, how long did you exercise for, and select weekly, you can see our average weekly exercise is 1 hour and 12 minutes. We can also add filters and everything if we wanted to. And of course we can also track things. We have these entry row widgets where we are able to quickly open up the tracking form modal, and we can just track something like we're feeling content right now, and we can see that this icon pops up. This should definitely be rounded, and as you notice, this is completely reactive, so whenever I track something here, it will update the values everywhere else. I can of course then track hydration. If I perhaps drank some water, if I save that, we can see that the daily hydration also updates here. We can also do some quick tagging, so just like we have the tagging view here, we can also quickly log some tags here, where we can also specify which categories that we want to show here. Maybe we don't want to show all the categories that we have in the system. We also have this neat little table widget where we can track things. Maybe I tracked the breakfast, I ate some meat, some calories, and if I save that now, we can see breakfast meat, but I can also perhaps track that I had dinner with some chicken, and we can see that this is now grouped based on the meal type that I have. So this is very easy to configure. We can specify what we want to group by. If we want to group by meal type, then we'll see them grouped by that specific meal type. We can also configure what we want to display here. So we can display perhaps also the amount of calories. We can have a dynamic value here that says calories. Then we can quickly see the calorie count for that logged value as well. Of course, we can also switch to a different day. If we wanted to see the values for perhaps Thursday, we can go back in time and see the values as they were then as well. And we can also move and play around with these widgets as we want. If we want this to be really wide, fat food widget, then we can do that. We can move around, and all of that works. And this is implemented with the awesome GridStack.js library. And this is a neat library because it's also built with responsiveness in mind. So here we have a different dashboard, my mobile dashboard, so to speak, where you can see that these widgets are laid out beautifully. And here we only have 2 columns. So we can see that we can specify how many columns we want. Here we have only 2 columns since we don't have such a wide screen. So how was this implemented in Svelte, you might ask? It did require some tweaking to get right, since this is not a Svelte 5 library. It's kind of framework agnostic. It works with any framework that you throw at it, I would say. Really nice library. But we did need to do some tweaking to get it completely right. So what we have here is our GridStack grid component. And so here we pass in our dashboard widgets as a prop to this GridStack grid component. We have one dashboard widget entity stored in the database for each of these widgets. They're not stored directly on the dashboard object themselves, but rather independently. So here we just have the ID, display dependencies. We have something similar to how we've done everything else. And here we have a union type for our dashboard widget type. So when the dashboard widget type is entry row, then we will also be finding a dashboard entry row widget settings. So we'll have different interfaces for all of these settings based on which kind of widget it is. Then when this component mount, we simply initialize our GridStack grid. Here we specify a bunch of options, how large we want our cell heights to be. This determines how fine-grained control we have in the vertical axis. So if we have a lower value here, then the user can pretty much have it in any vertical size. We also specify how many minimum rows that it will add a bunch more height. And here we can also specify the responsive breakpoints that we have. So we can specify that when the width is 768, well, then we only want 2 columns. So on mobile, we only have 2 columns, but rather on desktop, we have 30 columns. So quite a big difference there. And then we have some event handlers. So when we added a new grid stack item, when we pull in a new when we drag in a new grid stack item, that will be added. And also when we drag it, when we drag it or resize it, we also want to update it in the database. So when we set up our grid, we also dynamically create these grid stack widgets. So for that, we also need a dashboard widget definition, which I have defined for all of these widgets. They kind of determine things like the minimum height and the minimum width, and also the default settings for the dashboard widget. Then we create a new DOM element for that widget. Then we set the widget ID in the dataset so that we can identify it when we resize it or when we move it around. We need to be able to get that widget by its ID again so we can update it. And then we simply append the child to the parent grid. And here we are also using mount widget render. So we want to, of course, use components, our beloved Svelte components. We have a component that is called the dashboard widget renderer. So here we mount our dashboard widget renderer component with these props. We have the widget, we have the on click, on delete. So we specify some props that allow us to then pass that on to the dashboard view. For example, when we want to update the widget, when we want to delete the widget, all of that happens in this dashboard view. It's kind of a bit separate from the grid stack rendering. And inside of this dashboard widget renderer, we have our nice record that we have done previously, so that we can dynamically render a different component based on the dashboard widget type that we have. So if we have a dashboard widget type chart, then we specifically want to render a dashboard chart widget component. But something that I noticed with the Svelte 5 is that when you use this mount, you also need to remember to unmount the component. Specifically, when we remove a widget, for example, here we need to unmount the specific dashboard widget render. Otherwise, we don't get the on destroy events, which we are kind of using for these widgets as well. So we need to unmount that component in Svelte when we remove it, and when this parent component gets unmounted, perhaps when we move to a different page, then we want to get all of the mounted widgets and unmount all of them. We're also using an effect here, so whenever our edit state changes, then we set static. So this simply means that we can't move around widgets, we can't resize them and things like that. So if we take a look at one of these widgets, for example the dashboard chart widget, we have something looking like this. Here we're using width full and height full so that it fills out the user specified size. So if the user resizes this widget, we want to always follow that. So this will take up 100% of the width and height that the user has specified when they moved around it and pulled that resize handle. So my design philosophy when creating this widget is to try to keep the logic out of the components as best as I can. So I create these Svelte stores for everything. I have this chart widget store that contains the actual result, which is an async store. So it returns a promise. We aren't getting the result immediately, since we might need to do some number crunching. So then we can use Svelte await keyword here. But if we take a look inside of this chart widget store, this is where we are doing all of the fun stuff. So we have a chart widget result. This result that we are returning here contains all of the necessary information to present it in the view. We don't want to do all of this number crunching, setting up the data points and labels and doing mapping and looping and everything. Everything happens far away from the components themselves and rather is put inside of the stores that are responsible for doing that. And as you might have noticed, we're using these dependencies here, and these actually come from the widgets themselves, because the widgets themselves define what variables they want to use, whatever they want to depend on in the system. So if we take a look, for example, in the model for one of these widgets, if we take a look at the chart widget, we can see that this actually creates dependencies. It returns variables that it wants to be created. So when I create a new chart widget, I will be creating both a list and an aggregate variable that will be used for fetching the values in the system. So whenever I update my steps, we will get an update to this list variable, which will in turn update the aggregate variable as well. So here I name this aggregate, we have the actual variable definition here, and then we can use this variable ID with our beloved ranged variable value store. So we can depend on another Svelte store inside of this short widget store. So whenever that variable value store changes value, then we will re-render and update everything here as well. So this is where we loop through the result. We add all the data points and the labels that we have so that we can easily render it in the front end. We can of course also add new widgets to the dashboard. So I could pull out this goal widget here. And you see we have a nice way of just pulling out widget. It feels a bit more natural to just pull it out from a sidebar and add it to the dashboard. And how is this implemented in Svelte, you might ask? Well, of course, it's very straightforward. We have this really nice utility function called setup drag in, which simply specifies that this is a drag in element. It's an infinite element, so to speak. When I pull out one of these cards, it will not remove it from one grid. With GridStack, we can have multiple grids where we move them between grids. But here we have an infinite little shelf of items where we can just pull out as many items as we want. So we can do that with GridStack setup drag in. And this is simply a very simple divider where I just show the type for now. We might show an icon in the future. And then we just need to handle this a little bit in the GridStack grid. If we take a look, we have this on added. So we will loop over all of the items that were added and we check if it is a drag card. So this will actually be called when we loop over the elements on mount and also add them. So we only want this to be running when we're actually dragging in a new card. So here we have a drag card class. If it doesn't contain the drag card class, here we simply ignore it. But otherwise, then we get this dashboard widget type. We add it to the database, we remove the drag card classes, we make it a normal grid stack item, and then we also mount that widget to our GridStack grid. So another tweak that I had to do to GridStack to make it work even better was to also change the grid columns. So this kind of gives us a bit more degrees of freedom in how wide our widgets will be. So I can have a bit more fine-grained control if I have more columns spanning the width of the page. So we can specify that here. For this, we actually need to have extra CSS. So this is responsive. GridStack is written with CSS. If we want to change this, well, then we actually need to generate a new custom CSS file for this. So we can specify here that we want to have 20 columns or 30 columns in my case, and then we will just generate a new CSS file for that. So that's what I managed to implement this week. Overall, I'm very happy with this week's progress. I felt quite productive. I managed to push out loads of these different widgets, and I feel like it's coming together. It's becoming way more usable with a dashboard as well. Rather than have to go into these specific detailed views and click, I can see everything in one place, kind of configure it to my own liking. I can move these widgets around and add exactly what I want to see. So I hope that you guys found this video interesting. Feel free to give it a like if you did. And also feel free to follow along for next week. If you want to check out the code, it's on GitHub. And we also have a Discord channel if you want to join the community that I'm trying to build. But other than that, I will see you guys next week. Peace out.